In 1997, 16-year-old Sarah Mitchell left her house for a quiet morning walk in rural Oregon and never came back. At first, her disappearance raised little alarm. She was known to be independent, occasionally rebellious, but as hours turned into days and days into years, Sarah's case faded into silence. Until a new lead reignited everything 2 decades later. This full true crime episode dives deep into a story of broken trust, hidden trauma, and a family haunted by more than just unanswered questions. Interviews, psychological insight, and shocking revelations. We ask the question, was Sarah's disappearance really just a runaway story? Or something far more chilling? Watch the full episode and uncover the long-buried secrets of a girl the world forgot, but her story never ended. It was just after 7:15 a.m. on May 17, 1997, when 16-year-old Sarah Mitchell walked out the front door of her family's farmhouse in Pine Creek, Oregon, a quiet town tucked between misty hills and endless pines. She had done it 100 times before. Same route, same time. Same faded trail that wound through the edge of the woods, past the old dairy barn, and into the sleepy roads of town. But that morning, Sarah never came back. Her shoes were found 5 days later, left neatly side by side on the edge of a creek bed, as if someone had placed them there intentionally. There was no note, no signs of struggle, no clear reason why a girl who had promised her mom she'd be back in 30 minutes simply vanished. For weeks, search teams combed the woods. Helicopters scanned the landscape. Dogs tracked every scent, every footprint, every whisper of hope, but nothing. Not a single clue to tell them where Sarah had gone, or why. The case went cold. Her parents, Tom and Linda Mitchell, spent years chasing shadows. Every stranger in town became a suspect. Every phone call that rang in the middle of the night raised the same impossible hope. But as the seasons changed, and as new cases took priority, Sarah's story faded into silence. A missing poster left to weather in the rain, a name that became more memory than mystery. Until 2017, 2 decades later, a single piece of evidence overlooked, misfiled, and long dismissed surfaced in the archives of a private investigator's storage unit. A photograph, a letter, and a name that law enforcement had never taken seriously. And suddenly, the case of Sarah Mitchell wasn't over. It was just beginning. In the weeks following Sarah Mitchell's disappearance, the quiet rural town of Pine Creek became a swirl of speculation, fear, and frustration. The local sheriff's department, unaccustomed to handling major cases, let alone one involving a missing teenage girl, launched what they called a full-scale search and investigation. But to those closest to Sarah, especially her parents, it felt more like a slow, painful descent into helplessness. Tom Mitchell, Sarah's father, was a third-generation cattle rancher, stoic, quiet, and not one to show emotion easily. He became a man unrecognizable to his neighbors. He spent every daylight hour searching the fields, retracing every step his daughter could have taken, checking fence lines, trailheads, abandoned sheds. When the official search teams moved on, he kept going. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Sometimes, he admitted years later, he'd walk the woods not even expecting to find her, just unable to accept standing still. Linda, Sarah's mother, became the voice, the drive. The one who printed flyers, called radio stations, chased down leads, and showed up at every town hall, every media briefing. Her pain turned to purpose and, then to obsession. She kept a notebook by the end of 1997. It had over 200 names, people she had spoken to, questioned, or suspected. She circled patterns, made timelines, connected dots that no one else saw. But not everyone was sympathetic. Some in the community began whispering that Sarah had simply run away. She had been restless lately, they said. She talked about leaving Pine Creek, about traveling. She was known to go walking alone, writing poetry, keeping journals. No one was allowed to read. And yes, there had been tension at home. A fight with her mother the week before she disappeared. A disagreement about grades, a boy her parents didn't approve of. But Linda knew better. She might have been strong-willed, Linda said in a 2001 interview. But Sarah always came home. She always left a note, a sign, something. She didn't just disappear. Someone took her. The police followed their protocols. Interviews were conducted. Friends were questioned. The last person to see Sarah was her neighbor, Annie Redford, who had passed her around 7:30 a.m., walking toward the Ridge Trail, wearing a gray hoodie and carrying a journal under one arm. She smiled at me like she always did, Annie recalled. She didn't look scared. She didn't look like she was planning to run away. She looked normal, like she'd be home for breakfast. But as the days wore on and no new evidence came forward, the case stalled. Then came the first real lead. 2 hikers, 3 weeks after Sarah's disappearance, reported hearing a scream near an old irrigation canal deep in the woods, followed by what they thought was a vehicle driving off. They didn't report it right away, assuming it was nothing. But when they came forward later, the sheriff's office found tire tracks near the site. Unfortunately, the rain had washed away any identifiable marks, and no other evidence could be recovered. Still, it raised a terrifying possibility. If someone had taken Sarah, they might have known the area well enough to avoid detection. Someone local, someone trusted. The sheriff's department compiled a list of registered sex offenders within a 30-mile radius. None had alibis that checked out completely, but one name stood out: Daniel Cross, a 28-year-old handyman who had been hired to do repairs on several properties near the Mitchell farm, including the Redfords. He had a minor record trespassing, a dismissed charge of harassment, but nothing that triggered immediate action. He was questioned. He denied knowing Sarah, though Linda swore she had seen him watching her daughter from across the fence one evening. But without evidence, there was nothing the police could do. And slowly, painfully, the search for Sarah lost momentum. Media attention faded. Tips dried up. The file was closed, but never forgotten. 20 years passed. The case of Sarah Mitchell had long since moved from the front page to the back of the town. Memory, an open wound that the community no longer touched, not out of healing, but because it still hurt too much. Her parents had aged quietly, Tom, growing more distant, Linda clinging to hope in the form of dusty boxes stacked in their garage, filled with case files, news clippings, flyers, even receipts from phone calls made to tip lines that never returned answers. Sarah's room, though no longer exactly as it was, remained mostly untouched. A time capsule waiting for its clock to start again. Then, in early 2017, a box resurfaced. It belonged to retired private investigator Henry Vale, a man who had been hired privately by the Mitchells during the first year of Sarah's disappearance. When Vale passed away from a stroke, his niece began clearing out his storage unit in Portland. Among decades of files and photos, she found a folder marked only with 3 words: Mitchell Personal Hold. She nearly threw it away until curiosity stopped her. Inside were printed photographs, notes, and a torn, yellowed letter folded twice and sealed in an evidence envelope, never officially entered into any report. The letter was addressed to Essom. The handwriting was messy, rushed. No date, no return address. It read, "I didn't mean for it to go that far. I tried to stop him. I swear I did. But he said she'd ruin everything if she talked. He buried it near the old pump house. Please don't tell anyone. You'll understand one day." The niece, startled and unsure what it meant, turned it over to police. Within days, the cold case file of Sarah Mitchell was reopened on. The story that had gone silent was suddenly breathing again. Detectives analyzed the letter for fingerprints and ink dating. Results were inconclusive, too degraded after years in storage. But one thing was clear. The letter referenced a location that had never been mentioned in the original investigation. The old pump house, a long-abandoned utility building once used to serve the Mitchell farm and neighboring properties, had been sealed off since the early 1990s and sat in a fenced clearing behind a thicket of cedar trees. When police searched the site, they found the ground disturbed behind the eastern wall. Using ground-penetrating radar, they confirmed a void beneath the surface, large enough for a shallow grave. Excavation began the next morning. What they found wasn't Sarah. It was a backpack. Buried, wrapped in plastic, and water damage, but mostly intact. Inside, a denim jacket, a half-filled journal, pack of gum, a house key, and a school ID badge was Sarah's. The journal had survived just enough to reveal fragments, thoughts written in looping, anxious handwriting. Mentions of someone she called D, the fear of being followed, the fear that no one would believe her. The last legible entry read, I told him I wasn't going to keep it a secret anymore, that if he didn't leave me alone, I'd tell. He laughed. Said no one would believe a girl like me over a man like him. The letter, the journal, the location, they all pointed to one person, Daniel Cross. He had moved out of state in 2004, remarried, and was working under a new name in Idaho. Investigators tracked him down and brought him in for questioning. He was older, grayer, heavier, but his eyes, still alert, still calculating. He denied everything. Claimed he had never seen Sarah, never knew her, and that anything linking him to her was circumstantial. But they had more. A digital forensic review of Henry Vale's other files revealed photos taken in 1997 of Daniel S. truck parked near the pump house, even after it was sealed off. A witness statement from a now-deceased groundskeeper indicated Daniel had been seen digging in the area shortly after Sarah disappeared, but that note was never followed up on. Most damning of all, hair fibers found inside the backpack, preserved in a zipped pocket, matched DNA from Daniel Cross. He was arrested and charged with obstruction and suspicion of involvement in Sarah Mitchell's disappearance. Still, he refused to talk, and Sarah, her body was never found. The arrest of Daniel Cross in the fall of 2017 sent shockwaves through Pine Creek and far beyond. For some, it was vindication proof that Sarah hadn't simply run away, that her parents weren't chasing ghosts all those years. For others, it reopened wounds they'd long buried, forcing them to re-examine what they remembered about that spring in 1997. More importantly, what they chose to ignore. But for the Mitchells, it was complicated. They'd awaited 2 decades for answers. Now, they were told they had someone in custody, but still no body, still no confirmation, still no closure. Linda Mitchell stood on her porch the night of the arrest. Reporters gathered at the bottom of the driveway and said, through trembling lips, "I want to believe this is the beginning of the end, but until we bring Sarah home, this isn't finished." And then, something happened that no one expected. A letter arrived at the sheriff's department, postmarked from a small town in eastern Washington. It had no return address, just a short handwritten note. The handwriting was shaky, paper was old, water-stained, but the message was unmistakable. He wasn't the only one. She told me. I didn't listen. She was crying. "I should have done something. There's something in the journal. You have to find the red door." The letter didn't make sense, at least not immediately. But it was enough for detectives to reopen every piece of Sarah's journal, especially the water-damaged entries previously dismissed as unreadable. And there, on the back page, in red ink and barely visible beneath the smudges, was a single line. "If anything happens to me, look behind the red door. He won't know I have the key." It was a riddle, a code, a message Sarah had left in desperation, hoping anyone would one day find it. Investigators began retracing every property Daniel Cross had worked on in the 90s. Eventually, they landed on an old farmhouse he maintained for a widow named Evelyn Harrow. She had passed away in 2005, and the property had been left vacant ever since. Police obtained a warrant and returned to the house dusty, crumbling, overgrown with blackberry vines. And there it was, cellar door painted red, hidden beneath a layer of vines and warped plywood. They pried it open. Inside, a storm shelter, long unused, cold, damp, and claustrophobic. And along the interior wall, etched with faint fingernail marks, was a date, 5.1797. They searched the area inch by inch. No remains were found. But a small wooden box tucked into the corner held something equally powerful, a necklace. Silver, delicate, broken at the clasp. Linda Mitchell identified it on sight. "It was Sarah's," she whispered. "She wore it every day. It was her grandmother's." It wasn't the answer they wanted, but it was something, evidence, a trace of her, a place where she had been. And then, just when the case seemed to be building toward a conclusion, a name from the original case files resurfaced, one that had been buried beneath a stack of unrelated interviews. A high school janitor named Ray Dempsey. Back in 1997, Dempsey had worked part-time at Pine Creek High. He had been interviewed after Sarah went missing because he had reportedly seen her arguing with someone in the parking lot 2 weeks before she vanished. At the time, he claimed the man was too far away to see clearly, and the police had moved on. But in a newly digitized audio recording, Dempsey made an offhand comment to a deputy that was never followed up on. She was scared. Not of that guy, though. It was someone else. Someone closer. You know, the kind you don't talk back to? The deputy didn't press him. No follow-up question. No details logged. Detectives tracked down Dempsey, now retired and living in Arizona. When approached, he was visibly shaken. He said he had forgotten, that it was too long ago. He was old, and didn't want to be dragged into something so dark. But after some pressure, he agreed to talk, and what he revealed opened a new door. Sarah Mitchell had confided in someone in the days before she vanished. Not just about being followed, but about being watched, manipulated, controlled. And the person she was most afraid of wasn't Daniel Cross. It was someone she knew. Ray Dempsey's statement cracked the case open in a way no one saw coming. When detectives revisited the full transcript of his 1997 interview, now enhanced and transcribed by modern software, they discovered something buried not in words, but in tone. Dempsey hadn't just been uncertain back then, he had been afraid, carefully choosing what not to say. And now, 20 years later, he was finally willing to give names. There was someone she mentioned more than once, he said. Not by name at first. She called him the Watcher. Said she'd catch him watching her walk home from school. Thought he was harmless. But then, she stopped smiling when she talked about him. Pressed for more, Dempsey leaned forward, lowering his voice. She was talking about someone close, someone everyone trusted. The name he finally gave wasn't Daniel Cross. It was Deputy Alan Whitmore, decorated law enforcement officer. Whitmore had been a fixture in Pine Creek for over 3 decades. He's known for volunteering at youth events, showing up to Friday night football games, giving safety talks at the high school. He was the friendly face of local policing, a man no one would question. And in 1997, he had been one of the first to respond when Sarah went missing. He was also the officer who first interviewed Ray Dempsey, and the one who wrote the summary that omitted Dempsey's mention of the Watcher entirely. Detectives reopened Whitmore's file. No complaints, no disciplinary actions. But one detail stood out, a pattern of assignments that always placed him near the Mitchells' property. Routine patrols. Wellness checks. A sudden interest in farmland trespassing. Nothing illegal. Together. They painted a picture of proximity that now felt chilling. One old report stood out. Filed 5 weeks before Sarah's disappearance, it described a minor trespassing incident at the Mitchell home. Whitmore had responded and reported no suspicious activity, but Linda Mitchell remembered it differently. He showed up after dark, she said someone had called in a prowler, but we hadn't. Tom wasn't home. It was just me and Sarah. And there was something else, the weeks before Sarah vanished. Linda recalled finding her daughter crying in her room, her journal clutched to her chest, pages torn out. She just kept saying, "He won't stop. He thinks I'm keeping secrets." And when I asked who, she shook her head. She wouldn't tell me. With this new information, detectives obtained a warrant to search Alan Whitmore's property. Now retired and living just outside Pine Creek, he had always maintained a spotless reputation. But inside his detached garage, hidden in a locked cabinet behind old toolboxes, investigators found a single cardboard box. Inside were newspaper clippings, every article ever printed about Sarah's case, copies of her school photo, a flyer with a note scrawled in the margin. She never got to tell. She never got to run. But the most damning item was a small cassette, tape and labeled, degraded, but still playable. On it, the voice of a young girl, scared and breathless. "Please stop calling. I told you I'm not going anywhere with you. If you come here again, I'll tell." Then, another voice. Calm, older, chillingly familiar. "You don't tell stories about people who protect you, Sarah. You know that. I'm not going to let you ruin everything." Audio analysts compared the male voice to known samples of Whitmore's voice from police recordings. It was a match. Alan Whitmore was arrested within 48 hours and charged with obstruction, unlawful surveillance, and suspicion of involvement in the disappearance of Sarah Mitchell. He refused to speak, invoking his right to silence. But the evidence was growing and the narrative had changed. Daniel Cross had been a distraction, a man with a history, a suspect who fit the mold. But Whitmore had used his position to shift attention to control the investigation from within, suppressing leads, rewording witness statements, and directing suspicion away from himself. But still, one question remained: what happened to Sarah? As Alan Whitmore sat behind bars refusing to speak and denying all charges, the investigation turned to the final threads left dangling: Sarah's journal. Entries partially restored through forensic ink analysis, and a handful of people from her past who had either slipped through the cracks or were never asked the right questions. One of those people was Emily Travers, Sarah's closest friend during high school. Back in 1997, Emily had given a short, nervous interview to police where she said that she had seen or spoken to Sarah on the morning she disappeared. That was technically true. But what Emily hadn't revealed not then, and not for the 2 decades that followed, was that the night before Sarah vanished, they had spoken for over 2 hours on the phone. Emily never mentioned it. Why? Because Sarah had sworn her to silence. Now in her late 30s, Emily was living in Eugene, Oregon. A quiet life, 2 children, a teaching job. When detectives knocked on her door in 2018, she hesitated. She seemed torn between fear and relief. And then, quietly, she said, "I always knew this day would come." Emily's story was as heartbreaking as it was revealing. She said that in the weeks before Sarah disappeared, their conversations had changed. Sarah had grown more withdrawn, more anxious, often staring off in class or refusing to walk home alone. When pressed, she hinted at a relationship not romantic, but suffocating with someone much older. Someone who knew everything about her movements. Someone who had promised to protect her and then turned that protection into control. Emily thought it was a teacher, or maybe an older cousin. She never imagined it could have been a sheriff's deputy. But that final phone call, the one the night before Sarah vanished, haunted her. She said she was done being afraid, Emily recalled, voice shaking. She said she had hidden the key, that if anything happened to her, I'd know what to do. But I didn't know what she meant. Thought she was being dramatic. And then Emily handed the detectives something she had kept hidden for over 20 years. A tiny key. It's taped inside the back cover of a paperback book Sarah had lent her the week she vanished. She had forgotten it was there for years. Found it by accident during college, but never turned it in. Never told anyone. The key matched the lock to a small chest, recovered from the Mitchell family's barn during the initial search in 1997. Back then, it had been sealed, and since no one could open it, it was logged and eventually stored in evidence never opened, never prioritized. Now, with the key in hand, investigators opened it. Inside was a flash drive, an old one, bulky, scratched, half-corroded, but it still worked. It contained a series of scanned pages from Sarah's private, unshared journal. Pages she had intentionally kept hidden. The entries were dated 2 weeks before her disappearance. They painted a devastating picture of grooming, manipulation, and fear. One entry read, "He tells me I'm special, and no one else sees me like he does, but I feel small around him. Smaller every day. And when I try to pull away, he tells me I'm ungrateful. Dad, he's keeping me safe. That I owe him," another said. "He watches my window, leaves notes, calls from different numbers. I told Mom it was someone at school, but it's not. It's him." The most critical entry dated 3 days before she disappeared. "He said I should come with him, that it'd be easier that way, that no one would understand our connection. Called it our secret. But it's not a secret if I feel like I'm disappearing." These journal pages, combined with Whitmore's known proximity to the Mitchell home, and the recorded audio recovered from his garage, were enough for prosecutors to charge him formally with first-degree murder and unlawful restraint even without a body. And then, just days before trial was set to begin, a shocking development. A tip came in from a man named Caleb Morrow, a now-retired state parks employee. He had read about Sarah's case in the news, recognized a name, and said he believed he saw Deputy Whitmore at a restricted campsite near Deadfall Lake just weeks after Sarah's disappearance. He was off duty, out of jurisdiction, and alone. When questioned by Caleb, Whitmore claimed he was there investigating poaching, but no report had ever been filed. Search teams returned to Deadfall Lake with cadaver dogs, sonar equipment, and forensic specialists. Deep in a patch of forest near the lake's edge, buried beneath years of moss and fallen leaves, They found what they believed could be a shallow grave site disturbed. Soil, fragments of fabric, and what appeared to be a broken bracelet. It would take weeks to confirm. But for the first time in over 2 decades, there was hope that Sarah might finally be found. It took forensic analysts 3 weeks to confirm what Sarah's parents had already known in their hearts. The remains recovered near Deadfall Lake belonged to 16-year-old Sarah Mitchell. The DNA was a match. The bracelet found near the site had her initials carved on the inside. And tucked in the sleeve of what remained of her jacket was a page from her journal, folded tightly. Carefully sealed in a sandwich bag and preserved through time, it read, "If someone finds me, tell my mom I tried. Tell her I fought. Tell her not to be afraid to keep looking for the truth." At the announcement, Linda Mitchell wept. Tom stood quietly behind her, hand on her shoulder, eyes closed not from relief, but from the end of a chapter that should never have been written in the first place. In court, Alan Whitmore sat motionless as the prosecution played the final audio recordings. He was offered a plea deal in exchange for disclosing the full truth. He refused. He never spoke again. The jury found him guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even with a verdict, the story of Sarah Mitchell doesn't end with a courtroom. It lives on through the voices that refuse to stay silent. Through a mother who never stopped searching, through a best friend who finally shared the truth, and through the pages of a journal written by a young girl who saw what others didn't, Taeyeon found the courage to try to speak, even when no one was ready to listen. Today, a bench sits near the edge of Deadfall Lake. It bears her name. Below it, engraved in silver, are her own words. Don't be afraid to keep looking for the truth. Thank you for watching this episode. Sarah's story moved you, helped you see the power of never giving up, reminded you how important it is to believe victims when they speak. We invite you to like this video, leave a comment below, and share this story so others can hear it too. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you never miss the next story that needs to be heard, because every truth we uncover brings us one step closer to justice. And justice, no matter how long it takes, is always worth the fight.